My daughter and her husband took me hiking to a scenic cliff. When I was distracted admiring the view, he pushed me over the edge. Despite the agony, I stayed completely still. Their plan was to fake an accident and steal my $3 million inheritance. But I survived and turned their lives into a living nightmare. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I should have seen it coming when Sarah suggested the family hiking trip. My 35-year-old daughter never suggested anything that didn't benefit her directly. But there I was, 6 months after burying my husband Robert, desperately craving any connection with my only child and her husband Michael. "Mom, you've been cooped up in that house too long," Sarah had said during her rare phone call 3 weeks earlier. "Michael found this gorgeous trail in Colorado. The autumn colors are supposed to be spectacular this time of year. It'll be good for you to get some fresh air." Fresh air. As if grief could be cured by elevation and exercise. But I agreed because I missed her, missed the family dinners, missed feeling like I mattered to someone. Robert's death had left me wealthy but utterly alone, and Sarah knew exactly which buttons to push. The drive to Cliffside Trail took 2 hours from Denver. Michael chatted enthusiastically about his new promotion at the investment firm, while Sarah scrolled through her phone in the passenger seat. I sat in the back like a child, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to rolling hills dotted with golden aspens. "This is perfect weather for hiking," Michael said, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Not too hot, not too cold, and the visibility today is incredible." The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty on this Tuesday morning. Most sensible people were at work, not dragging their recently widowed mothers up mountain paths. But Michael had insisted Tuesday was better. Fewer crowds, better photo opportunities. "Let's get some pictures before we start," Sarah said, suddenly animated. She pulled out her phone and began taking shots of the three of us by the trail marker. "Mom, move a little to the left. Perfect. This is going to be such a nice memory." Memory. The word should have triggered alarm bells, but I was too grateful for her attention to question anything. The trail began gently, winding through stands of aspen and pine. Michael carried a large backpack filled with water bottles, granola bars, and what he called emergency supplies. Sarah walked between us, occasionally linking her arm through mine in a gesture that felt more performed than genuine. "Remember when we used to hike when you were little?" I asked her as we navigated a particularly rocky section. "Not really," she replied, her voice distracted. "Michael, how much further to the viewpoint?" "About another mile," he said, checking his GPS watch. "Trust me, it's worth it. The cliff overlooks the entire valley." Cliff, another word that should have raised red flags. But I was 65 years old, reasonably fit, and confident in my ability to handle a moderate hiking trail. What I wasn't prepared for was my own family's capacity for betrayal. The viewpoint was everything Michael had promised. A dramatic granite outcropping that jutted out over a 200-foot drop into a rocky ravine below. The autumn foliage spread out like a patchwork quilt, breathtaking in its beauty. "Isn't this incredible, Mom?" Sarah said, suddenly solicitous. "Come closer to the edge. You can see the whole valley from here." I should have noticed how they positioned themselves behind me. Should have questioned why Michael was adjusting his backpack straps so carefully, why Sarah was checking her phone again, why they both seemed nervous despite the successful hike. Instead, I stepped closer to the edge, mesmerized by the view. The wind caught my hair, and for a moment, I felt something approaching peace for the first time since Robert's funeral. That's when I felt Michael's hands on my back. The push was quick, calculated, and brutal. One moment I was admiring the golden valley below. The next I was tumbling through empty air, branches tearing at my clothes, rocks scraping against my skin. My nursing training kicked in even as I fell. Protect your head. Try to control the landing. Don't fight the momentum. But physics doesn't care about training, and gravity doesn't negotiate. I hit a ledge about 30 feet down, my left shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain exploded through my body like lightning, but the ledge was narrow, barely 3 feet wide. One wrong move, and I'd continue falling to the bottom of the ravine. Above me, I could hear voices. Sarah's panicked-sounding cry of, "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" Michael's urgent shouts about calling for help. To anyone listening, they sounded like distraught family members dealing with a tragic accident, but I could see them from my position on the ledge. Sarah was looking down, not with horror, but with calculation. Michael had pulled out his phone, but he wasn't dialing 911. He was texting someone. My medical background had taught me to stay still when injured, to assess damage before moving. That caution probably saved my life, because it kept me quiet long enough to hear their real conversation. "Can you see her?" Michael asked, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "She's on that ledge," Sarah replied, her tone completely different from the panicked daughter act she'd performed moments earlier. "Is she moving?" "Doesn't look like it." "Should I throw some rocks?" "No, you idiot. It has to look like an accident. Besides, it's a 30-foot fall onto granite. She's probably already dead." Already dead. My own daughter was standing 30 feet above me, calmly discussing whether I was dead yet, and sounding almost disappointed that I might have survived their murder attempt. "What if she's just unconscious?" Sarah asked. "What if someone finds her and she wakes up?" "Then we stick to the story," Michael said. "She was admiring the view, got too close to the edge, slipped and fell. We're devastated. We tried to save her. These things happen with elderly people." Elderly people. I was 65, not 90, but to them, I was just an old woman whose time had conveniently come. "How long do we wait?" Sarah asked. "Give it another 10 minutes, then we hike back down and call emergency services. By the time they get here and retrieve the body, we'll be the grieving family." I forced myself to remain perfectly still, even though my shoulder felt like it was on fire and I could taste blood in my mouth. Every instinct screamed at me to call out, to let them know I was alive, to beg for help. But something deeper, some survival instinct born from 65 years of being underestimated, kept me silent. "The lawyer said the will reading is next week," Michael continued. $3 million in investments, plus the house. We can pay off the credit cards, the mortgage, maybe even buy that place in Aspen you wanted. "What about the life insurance?" Sarah asked. "Another $2 million. This little hiking trip is going to solve all our financial problems. $5 million. That's what my life was worth to them. $5 million and the freedom to live without the inconvenience of an aging mother who expected to be included in their lives. We should probably act more upset when we call it in," Sarah said. "Really sell the tragedy. Don't worry, baby, I've got this. I'll handle the authorities, you handle the tears." They spent another 8 minutes discussing the logistics of their performance. Who would call 911, what they would say, how they would explain the delay in reporting my accident. They had clearly thought this through, planned it carefully, chosen this remote location specifically because it would be hours before help arrived. Finally, I heard their footsteps moving away from the edge as they began their hike back to the parking lot. Sarah called out one last time, "Mom, can you hear me? We're going to get help." The concern in her voice was Oscar-worthy. But I was done being their victim. The fall had been meant to kill me, but instead it had revealed the truth about who my daughter really was. And now I had something they didn't know I possessed, knowledge of their plan, and the burning desire to destroy them with it. The pain in my shoulder was excruciating, but I was alive, I was conscious, and I was angrier than I'd ever been in my entire life. Sarah and Michael had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they were heading back to collect their inheritance, but they were actually walking into a trap they didn't even know existed yet. It took me 47 minutes to climb off that ledge. Every movement sent waves of pain through my dislocated shoulder, but fury is a powerful anesthetic. My daughter and her husband were probably calling 911 right about now, reporting their tragic accident with practiced grief in their voices. The climb down from the ledge was treacherous, but my nurse's training included basic first aid and emergency procedures. I knew how to splint an arm, how to move with a dislocated shoulder, how to find handholds on rock faces, skills I'd learned in wilderness medicine courses that Robert had encouraged me to take years ago. "You never know when you'll need to save someone's life," he used to say. He just never imagined I'd be saving my own from our daughter. By the time I reached the bottom of the ravine, I could hear sirens in the distance. The emergency vehicles were arriving right on schedule, just as Sarah and Michael had planned. I followed a creek bed that ran parallel to the main trail, staying hidden in the tree line until I reached the road about half a mile from the parking area. A tourist couple from Texas stopped when they saw me stumbling along the roadside, my clothes torn and blood on my face. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" the woman asked, jumping out of their SUV. "Do you need medical attention?" "I took a fall on one of the trails," I said, which was technically true. "Could you drive me to the nearest urgent care clinic? I think my shoulder is dislocated." They were kind people, the sort who would help a stranger without asking too many questions. I made up a story about hiking alone, taking a wrong turn, slipping on loose rocks. They tisked sympathetically and drove me to a clinic in the next town over, insisting on waiting while I got checked out. The doctor confirmed my shoulder was dislocated, along with several nasty scrapes and what would become spectacular bruises. "You're lucky," he said while resetting the joint. "Falls like that can be fatal at your age." At my age, everyone kept reminding me how old I was, how fragile, how lucky to be alive. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt dangerous. I paid cash for the treatment, giving a false name and address. No insurance cards, no paper trail. As far as the medical system was concerned, a woman named Helen Roberts had been treated for hiking injuries. Margaret Thompson was still lying dead at the bottom of a cliff, or so her family believed. The Texas couple offered to drive me home, but I declined, claiming my son was coming to pick me up. Instead, I took a taxi to a motel on the outskirts of town, paid for 3 nights in advance, and settled in to plan my revenge. The news report that evening was exactly what I expected. Local woman dies in hiking accident. There was a brief interview with Sarah and Michael, both looking appropriately devastated. Sarah had managed to produce real tears, which was more acting ability than I'd given her credit for. She loved the outdoors, Sarah told the reporter, her voice breaking. She just wanted to see the autumn colors one more time. If only we'd stayed closer to her, if only we'd been more careful. Michael wrapped his arm around his wife protectively. "Margaret was like a second mother to me," he said. "We're going to miss her terribly. She lived such a full life, and she died doing something she loved. Such a full life, past tense. In their minds, I was already buried and forgotten, nothing more than a bank account waiting to be emptied. I spent the next 2 days watching them from a distance. They went through the motions of grief beautifully, meeting with funeral directors, accepting condolences from neighbors, playing the part of a devastated family. But when they thought no one was looking, I caught glimpses of their real selves. Michael researching luxury cars on his phone while sitting in the funeral parlor. Sarah browsing vacation rental websites during what was supposed to be a somber dinner with Robert's old friends. They weren't mourning my death. They were celebrating their windfall. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday. I learned this by calling my attorney's office, disguising my voice as Sarah's assistant. The entire estate, house, investments, life insurance, would officially transfer to my grieving daughter within the week. But here's the thing about being dead. It gives you remarkable freedom to act without consequences. Dead people don't have reputations to protect, relationships to maintain, or social conventions to follow. Dead people can be absolutely ruthless, and I had 6 days to become the most ruthlessly effective dead person who ever walked the earth. Being dead is surprisingly liberating. I spent the 3rd day after my murder doing something I'd never done in 65 years of law-abiding life. I broke into my own house. Sarah and Michael were at the funeral home making arrangements for my memorial service. Nothing too expensive, of course, since they were still pretending to be financially struggling. I knew their schedule because I'd been following them, and grief-stricken relatives are remarkably predictable in their routines. The spare key was still hidden under the fake rock by the back patio, exactly where Robert had placed it 5 years ago. In case of emergencies, he'd said. This definitely qualified. Walking through my own home as a dead person was surreal. Everything looked the same, but I could see it now through Sarah and Michael's eyes, not as my sanctuary, but as their jackpot. The Waterford crystal collection Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, the antique furniture my grandmother had left me, the paintings we'd collected during our European trips. All of it was about to become theirs, along with the insurance money that would let them live like royalty for the rest of their lives. I headed straight for Robert's study, where he'd kept all our important documents. Sarah and Michael had already been through here. I could tell by the slightly disturbed papers and the way the filing cabinet drawer wasn't quite closed properly. They'd probably been looking for investment statements and insurance policies, calculating their windfall, but they'd missed what I was looking for. Robert's old recording equipment. My husband had been a meticulous man who believed in documenting everything. He'd recorded every business meeting, every important phone call, every conversation that might someday matter. Trust, but verify, he used to say, and always keep records. The digital recorder was exactly where I remembered it, tucked away in his desk drawer along with the tiny wireless microphones he'd used for board meetings. Technology he'd insisted on learning, even though it frustrated him. "Margaret, we're living in the digital age," he'd said. "We need to adapt or get left behind." Now his paranoid attention to documentation was going to save my life. I spent 2 hours setting up a surveillance system that would have made the FBI proud. Tiny microphones in their bedroom, living room, and kitchen. The main recording device hidden in the basement, behind the water heater where they'd never think to look. Everything voice-activated. Everything saved to a cloud server that Sarah didn't even know existed. While I worked, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been just 3 days ago. Trusting, naive, desperate for my daughter's love. That woman had died on the cliff just as surely as if she'd hit the rocks below. The woman rigging surveillance equipment in her own house was someone entirely new. I also planted something else. A folder filled with fake financial documents suggesting that Robert had been hiding debts, that the inheritance wasn't as substantial as Sarah believed. Let them sweat a little while they waited for the will reading. Before leaving, I took one last look at the family photos lining the hallway. Sarah as a baby, her first day of school, her wedding to Michael. In every picture, she was smiling, happy, surrounded by parents who adored her. When had that sweet child turned into a woman who could push her mother off a cliff for money? The answer didn't matter anymore. The daughter I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw murder as a financial planning strategy. And that stranger was about to learn that dead mothers can be far more dangerous than living ones. My phone buzzed with a text message. I'd kept my old phone, knowing Sarah would expect it to be found with my body eventually. The message was from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. "Sarah told me about your accident. I'm so sorry for her loss. You were such a wonderful woman." Were. Past tense. Even my neighbors believed I was dead. I texted back, "Thank you for your kindness." Margaret would have appreciated knowing she had such caring neighbors. It felt good to speak about my former self in the past tense. That trusting, grateful woman was gone forever. The woman who remained had work to do. The memorial service was held on Saturday at the Methodist Church, where Robert and I had been married 37 years ago. I watched from my rental car across the street, wearing a brown wig and oversized sunglasses I'd purchased at a pharmacy. The turnout was respectable, about 40 people, mostly Robert's former colleagues and neighbors who remembered me fondly. Sarah had done a decent job organizing everything, though I noticed she'd chosen the least expensive flowers and had clearly instructed the caterer to keep costs minimal. Michael gave a moving eulogy about what a wonderful mother-in-law I'd been, how much I'd meant to their family, how the hiking accident had robbed them of precious years together. His performance was flawless, right down to the slight tremor in his voice when he described finding Margaret at the bottom of the cliff, finding me, as if they hadn't pushed me over the edge themselves. Sarah wept beautifully during the entire service. Designer tissues, perfect makeup that ran just enough to look authentic. She'd always been dramatic, even as a child, but this was a masterclass in deception. After the service, I followed the small group back to my house for the reception. Sarah had hired caterers and opened the good wine, Robert's expensive collection that she'd always coveted. I parked 3 houses down and activated the recording system from my phone. Through the wireless microphones I'd planted, I could hear everything. "The insurance adjuster is coming Monday," Michael told Sarah as they stood in the kitchen, their voices low. "He said it's routine for accidental death claims this size, but he doesn't expect any problems." "What about the will reading?" Sarah asked. "Tuesday at 10. Jenkins said it's straightforward. Everything to you as the sole heir. No complications, no challenges expected." "Good. I can't keep pretending to be heartbroken much longer. Mrs. Patterson from next door keeps bringing me casseroles and asking if I need anything. It's exhausting." I gripped my phone tighter. Exhausting. Playing the grieving daughter was exhausting for her. Once the insurance money comes through, we can pay off the credit cards and start looking seriously at that house in Aspen. Michael continued. Maybe take a trip to Europe to help with the grief. They actually laughed at that. My daughter and her husband were standing in my kitchen, drinking my wine and laughing about their plans to spend my life insurance money on a grief vacation. I do feel a little bad about the hiking thing, Sarah said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Maybe we could have found another way. Like what? Wait for her to die naturally? She could have lived another 20 years. Sarah, 20 years of family dinners and birthday calls and Christmas presents. 20 years of her thinking she had a right to be part of our lives. You're right. And honestly, she was getting more demanding lately. Always wanting to know what we were doing, always expecting invitations to everything. It was becoming a problem. A problem. I had become a problem that required a permanent solution. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more guests, but I'd heard enough. I had them on record discussing the murder, the insurance fraud, their complete lack of remorse. But I needed more than just confessions. I needed evidence that would hold up in court. That's when I remembered the life insurance policy details. The $5 million policy Robert had taken out 2 years ago required a waiting period for suicide claims. But there was something else. It also had a clause about deaths under investigation. If there was any question about the circumstances of death, the insurance company would conduct their own investigation before paying out. Time to make them sweat. I drove to the nearest internet cafe and created an anonymous email account. Then I sent a message to the insurance company's fraud investigation division. You should look more carefully at the Margaret Thompson death claim. Ask her daughter why she took out a cash advance on her credit card the day before the hiking trip. Ask her husband why he Googled life insurance waiting periods 2 weeks ago. Some accidents aren't really accidents. I didn't sign it, but I included enough specific details to ensure they'd take it seriously. Insurance companies hate paying out claims, and they especially hate being defrauded. The email was sent at 11:47 p.m. Saturday night. By Monday morning, Sarah and Michael's carefully planned inheritance would be frozen pending investigation. Phase 1 of my revenge was complete. Now it was time for Phase 2, making them understand exactly what they'd lost when they decided to murder their mother. The insurance investigator arrived Tuesday morning at 8:30 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled will reading. I watched from my new vantage point, a coffee shop across from my house that had excellent Wi-Fi and clear sightlines to the front door. Sarah answered the door in a black dress, still playing the grieving daughter role. But I could see her confusion through the window as Detective Morrison showed his badge and asked to come inside. This wasn't part of their script. Through my surveillance system, I heard every word. Mrs. Walsh, I'm Detective Morrison with the Insurance Fraud Division. We've received some information regarding your mother's death that requires follow-up investigation. Information? Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the tension. What kind of information? The kind that suggests your mother's death might not have been the accident you reported, Morrison said. We'll need to ask you and your husband some questions. Michael appeared in the background, and I could practically feel his panic through the microphone. This is ridiculous, he said. Margaret fell off a cliff. It was a tragic accident. We were there. Yes, you were there, Morrison agreed. That's exactly what we need to discuss. The questioning went on for an hour. Morrison was thorough, asking about the timeline, the location choice, their financial situation, the timing of various credit card transactions. Sarah and Michael stuck to their story, but I could hear the cracks forming. Why did you choose that particular trail? Morrison asked. Michael found it online, Sarah replied. He thought Mom would enjoy the scenery. And you'd never been there before? No, never. But I knew that was a lie. I'd found the browser history on Michael's computer during my house break-in. He'd researched that trail extensively, looking for information about emergency response times, cell phone coverage, and accident statistics. This wasn't a spontaneous family outing. It was a carefully planned murder scene. Mrs. Walsh, can you explain this cash advance? Morrison asked, and I heard papers rustling. $5,000 withdrawn from your credit card the day before the hiking trip? Silence. Sarah was probably trying to come up with a plausible explanation